To continue our study of polynomial functions, we need to move outside the real number system to the complex number system. This allows us to expand our study from real zeros to imaginary zeros. So a complex number is the combination of a real part and an imaginary part, and can be written in this form: a plus bi. I is called the imaginary unit. It allows us to take the square root of -1. Or a negative number. I is defined as the square root of -1. Alternatively, you can say I squared is -1. So for example, the square root of -81 is the square root of -1 times 81. So that's the square root of -1 times the square root of 81. So that is I times the square root of 81. And of course we can take the square root of 81. That is I times 9. And usually we write the number in front of I and call that 9i. The square root of -7. That is the square root of -1 times 7. So that is going to be I root 7. And a lot of times when you have a radical involved, you leave the number after I. So I root 7 is the usual way to read and write that. Square root of -50. That is the square root of -1 times 50. So that is going to be the square root of -1 times the square root of 50. This is I, and then we would just simplify the square root of 50. So that's going to be 5 root 2, and then many times, often, you see 5, the whole number part, in front of the I, and the radical after the I. So the complex numbers, they include real and imaginary numbers and combinations thereof. So real numbers just have no imaginary part. Imaginary numbers have an imaginary part. Furthermore, in the real number system, we can have rational numbers and irrational numbers. So remember, irrational numbers cannot be written as fractions. So just a note here, complex does not necessarily mean imaginary. Complex number include all numbers. They can be all real or all imaginary or a combination of both. So real numbers and imaginary numbers together make up the complex number system.